the Saugus Public Library. We have a very special event I'm kind of excited about. Well, not kind of excited about it, I'm actually quite excited about it. We just finished celebrating the signing of the Declaration of Independence last week, at that big anniversary. And it seems fitting that we should be talking about free speech tonight, not only because of the calendar, the recently passed anniversary, but also because of the current state of civic discourse in political and social circles these days, and talk about press expressing their own opinions or not expressing their own opinions or making up lies. So it's a very hot topic thing that we have going on. So we're excited to host people from the New England First Amendment Coalition tonight. I'd like to introduce the panel for the discussion. Panelists starting over here on your left is Maggie Mulvihill, former investigative journalist for the Herald and for WHDH-TV, now instructor in computation journalism at Boston University. In the center is Peter Caruso, Esquire, Caruso & Caruso LLP, whose practice includes First Amendment and media law. And the moderator for tonight's event is going to be Richard Lodge, who's the editor of the Newburyport Free Press. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Richard.
Thank you, sir. It's actually the Daily News of Newburyport. That's all right. That's all right. But we'll take it. Free press is a good thing to have in your name.
You should change it.
Yeah. Well, no, we like it. It's started back in the mid-1800s, so it's a good name to have. Newburyport actually has a long tradition of supporting the First Amendment. There's actually a paperback book that lists dozens and dozens of newspapers that have existed in Newburyport, some for as little as one edition. But back in the 1800s, if you had a printing press or knew somebody who had one, apparently there was a lot to write about on the North Shore. And the newspapers also traded stories and gossip and opinion pieces, and so there was ways to fill your newspaper pretty easily. Today there's just a Daily News covering the city of Newburyport and a bunch of small towns around it. So I'm happy to be here. I'm kind of daunted because I have two lawyers on the panel, but both with very, very extensive experience with the First Amendment and publishing. And I just want to talk for a minute. I'm going to let Peter actually, I think, read or recite the First Amendment because he does it really, really well. I would have to read it, although I know it. But earlier this week, there was a column in the New York Times in which the columnist talked about how President Trump in the past year had used the term fake news something like 600 times, and that about 50 foreign officials, presidents, prime ministers, diplomats in different countries, 50 of them had also used the term fake news. And that's, that's just probably counting press reports. And it's kind of stunning to somebody who's been in the news business for more than 40 years, like myself. And I think it's stunning for anybody in journalism that a phrase like that has begun to resonate so widely and to be adopted by so many people as a way to delegitimize basically real journalism and real reporting. And I just want to note for the audience, we are going to take questions. We're going to talk a little bit, and I have a few questions for the panelists. But we certainly want to hear from you folks tonight and hope that we can shine a light on things, or maybe not. But we'll certainly want to hear from you. But the journalism is pretty embattled right now in this country, and in other countries it's actually being fairly crushed, with reporters arrested, murdered in some cases, and even in the U.S. there have been a fair number of reporters just in the last couple of years who've been harassed, shouted down by crowds, roughed up, notes taken, recorders taken. So kind of an unprecedented level of combat out there to try to get to the story and report the news and to do their jobs. So that's especially troubling. But I think you folks, the public, are also probably wrestling with the essential question, which is sort of who do you believe and how do you know what's true, and how do you know what sources of information to trust, especially with the proliferation of social media? I wrestle with that myself quite a bit. Things have gotten very complicated. So I think the question is, the First Amendment still valid and useful today with media being so fragmented? And it's just so easy for people to quickly pass along information, and whether they verify it or not. So that's kind of where we're going to go a little bit tonight, and I hope you stay with us. I'm going to hand it over to Maggie and let her talk a little bit about her background and how you got here.
Hi, thank you for having me. So my name's Maggie Mulvihill, and I started my career as a First Amendment lawyer in New York City for a book publisher. Maybe you've heard of it, Harper and Row, which is now HarperCollins. And I was a junior counsel. I did pre-publication review. I would work with authors, Wolf Blitzer, Roseanne Barr, some famous people who wrote books, and tell them what they could or could not say. Did they have sources for this information? Anyway, I very quickly, after passing the New York and Massachusetts bar, which was a lot of work, realized I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a newspaper woman, and so that is what I really am in my heart. Although now I teach data journalism at Boston University, and what that means is I teach students how to scrape from the web and analyze and visualize and clean big data. And the reason I do that is because we now no longer get information as reporters on paper. It's digitized and in voluminous quantities and at an alarming rate for us to keep up with. So we don't have to. We don't need paper skills anymore. We need digital skills, and on the point that Richard made about journalism and what journalism is today, because I get a lot of students whose parents don't want them to go into journalism. And I don't understand this. I get so frustrated. We need good investigative journalism so badly. We need it in every era. We certainly need it today. And the evolution of journalism is just, newspapers aren't dying. They're just being transformed into a digital format. It's just a transformation. We had the candle, and then we had the light bulb, and we had the horse and buggy, and then we had the automobile. So why is it so hard for these parents to see that we had a newspaper, we had news printed on a page, and now it's in the computer or on the phone? And I've never seen a more robust, vivid job market for young journalists, especially those with investigative and data skills, than I have today. In 2007, at the height of the recession, there were no jobs for journalists. There are so many jobs for journalists today, especially young reporters with really good digital skills. And so it's a thriving job market, is my point. And I think there's this myth that journalism is dying. It is absolutely thriving. I'm on the front lines in education and getting my kids jobs. And, they're maybe not in the small town newspapers, but there's all kinds of other formats and ways that news is being delivered today. Podcasts and online sites. I started an investigative reporting center after I got laid off from my TV job, and I wanted to keep doing this work. So I raised money with a colleague, and we started a new way to do investigative reporting. So anyway, that's just a little bit about my background. I really believe so strongly in this kind of work, and I hope I can share with you what the next generation of journalists are, how they view the First Amendment, and some of the challenges around that. But I think, should I pass it to Peter now? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That's fine. The First Amendment has 5 rights that are in this wonderful amendment that's been the basis of our government. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, or to petition the government for redress of grievances. There's a lot in that First Amendment. I am an originalist and a purist for the First Amendment. I don't believe that we should have any statutes. I don't believe we should have any restrictions at all on the First Amendment. Our forefathers believed that we fought from England. We wanted to have free religion. We wanted to have free press. We wanted to have freedom of, to assemble, freedom of speech, and we have it here in America. Richard had mentioned, I always ask this question, who owns the First Amendment? Mm-hmm. And when I ask that of students, everyone says, well, you know, we own it, or all of us own it, the community owns it. I don't believe that's true. I think that the person who owns the First Amendment is Richard's boss. The publisher of a newspaper owns the First Amendment. A little bit on the side, but they can say what they want to say. Richard mentioned that in Newburyport, we had many newspapers. In Boston, we've got 2 newspapers. However, in every political cycle, Ben Franklin used to create 3 or 4 newspapers because you can say whatever you want to say. And you can say it freedom. You're not going to get sued. If you get sued, you're going to win. That's the First Amendment. So in cities doing political elections, the papers multiply. We had 4, 5, 6 papers. Political season ends, we go back to 1 or 2 papers. That's how strong the First Amendment is. And Maggie talked about, you know, who do we believe? Do we believe the press? Is it fake news? Is it not fake news? I had the unfortunate circumstance, because I was very young at the time, 27 years old, to babysit Bob Woodward. This is after he came out with his book. And I'm in Washington, D.C. at the press club, and they look around the room, and they says, Peter, you get stuck with him in the room. So I'm stuck with him for 15 minutes before he spoke. And he said, I always remember this. He said, you know, people believe everything that they read in the newspaper. And people believe nothing that they read in the newspaper. It's that paradox. And we do. We absorb everything, we believe it. And they say, well, gee, you know, is it really true? Now, we talk about press accounts, we talk about fake news. Okay. We do have fake news today. And I tell you why. Because the reporters who report on that should be fired when they report on a story that is inaccurate, that is false. In the old days, when we had family-owned newspapers, they would come to me. Pam Smart, and I just mentioned the case, prime example, the Pam Smart case up in New Hampshire. I get a call at 10 o'clock on Saturday night from the editor. And Bob says, Peter, I have the story and I want to run it by you. We have this teacher whose husband got killed. And we think that she orchestrated this with her students. 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. I said, oh, good story, fine. How are you going to prove that? Well, that's my problem. I have 2 sources. One came from a lawyer who represented the legitimate sources. One was the driver of the car, and one was the person who helped the shooter. So I says, 2 sources, huh? He says, yeah, I know. You want 3. My criteria is, I don't have 3 sources. I don't run an investigative story. I want 3 unbiased sources. He says, fine. I said, you can run it if you want. He says, yeah, and if I get sued, what's going to happen? The publisher's going to sue me. Every writer's going to sue me. So on Monday morning, I get a call from the attorney from the Manchester Union leader, Greg Sullivan. And Greg says, Peter, you got a call over the weekend? I says, yeah. He says, how many sources do you have? I said, 2. He says, I only have 2 too. You going to run it? I says, no, not on my watch. He says, I'm not either. So the union leader and the Eagle Tribune did not run the story. Of course, Greg told me, he says, when you get the 3rd source, can you call me? I said, yeah, sure, no problem at all. I'll give you a call as soon as I get the 3rd source. We got the 3rd source on Tuesday night, okay? We ran the paper, morning paper, the Tribune. We ran it at 7 o'clock in the morning. So at 8 o'clock, of course, I called Greg. I said, hi, Greg. He said, yeah, we did too. Why didn't you call? I said, I called you as soon as I could. But the moral of the story is, reporters looked for 3 sources. We didn't have 3 sources, legitimate sources. We didn't run the story. Today, people are looking for eyeballs, they're looking for digital, it's a money thing. I believe that, again, the First Amendment is a strong amendment. I don't think we should have any I am the only one, and I'll stop with this, I'm the only one that, not the only one, there's Bill Ketter also, who does not believe we should have a reporter's privilege law. That reporter's privilege law is that reporters should not be subpoenaed. Reporters should not be dragged into court. I don't believe we need that law. I'm in the minority for press lawyers, and I've been a press lawyer since 1977, because we already have a law. And that law is the First Amendment. Every case that I've argued in court to represent a newspaper, to represent a reporter who's been subpoenaed, I've won every single case since 1977 except for 2. One, because the attorney had gone to the publisher and got to the editor and says, gee, I have to go to court today, to Al White. Why? Well, because I've been cooperating with the attorney for the other side, and I'm going to testify this afternoon. He said, have you spoken to Peter? Well, no. Why should I speak to Peter? I went in with him. The judge says, hey, he's already spoken to the lawyers. So I did help him through it, but that's the only case that I've lost. The judges have said, once they realized, and when I go into court, and I talk about this funny thing called the First Amendment in district court, whether it's in Saugus, whether it's in Lynn, whether it's in Lawrence, the judge looks at me and says, I have assault and battery case. I have a motor vehicle case. What do you mean the First Amendment? What are you doing here? But when you explain to them why you're there, your eyes light up. I mean, you're right. And my argument for a reporter is the reporter should never, ever, never have to testify unless they were the only person in the room when someone shot someone. And the reporter, and they are generally subpoenaed when they're in a crowd or when they're at an accident scene and there are 25 firemen, 25 policemen, or there's a crowd. I say, exhaust all those sources. Go through everyone who witnessed what happened, and then you can get to the reporter. And a light goes off in the judge's mind, and then he turns to the DA and he says, are you having the newspaper do your job? How many people have you contacted? Attorney Caruso, you're right. The reporter does not have to testify, and I'm going to go exhaust the sources. Now, at the time, my reporter was not in the courthouse, because my reporter was in the courtroom. The judge would say, I've got 20 cases at 2 o'clock, just get the person up here. So I have the person in the Dunkin' Donuts about a block and a half away. So when the judge asks me, where's the reporter? I just tell him, no, she's not in the courtroom. He goes ballistic. I mean, what do you mean it's not in the courtroom? And then I explain my case. So I say this because the First Amendment is so strong, and there are other points we'll talk about tonight, that we don't need another law to protect our freedom of speech and the reporters and our freedom of the press. We have this strong law. The open meeting law, we don't need open meeting law. Public records law, we don't need a public records law. Okay? Let me tell you why. In 1977, when I started, we didn't have these laws. If you go back, that's when in 1977 when we had them. So the public records law today, okay, has 20 exceptions. I'm fighting 20 freaking exceptions when a public record is in fact, let me think, a public record. Open meeting. All meetings should be, let me think, open. But we have 10 exceptions, and we have this funny thing called an executive session, where I tell my reporters never to write in the report. My wife has no idea what an executive session is. You know what it is? It's a secret session. The paper writes, the school committee went into secret session last night to discuss the superintendent's salary. And suddenly, everyone understands that it's a secret session.
And they discuss something else.
And you know what? And you know what?
That's right.
They discuss something else about the football and everything else. So what I asked for are the notes, which you're eligible to get the next day. The raw notes, not the sanitized notes. They're in there for an hour and a half, and you get a half a page. So I said, you get you've been in there for an hour and a half. So you can get the actual secretary's notes, the raw notes. The law in Massachusetts says you can get the raw notes before they're typed up, and you get the sanitized version. So I'm not you have a question?
No, please.
Well, let me, if you folks, when you have a question, you are going to have to use a microphone because this is on cable, so.
Just yell.
Yeah, it's a technology thing. One thing Peter didn't mention is, I mean, he's saying we don't need a public records law and an open meeting law, and the body that established and changed those laws and added all the exemptions, the legislature is exempt from the open meeting law and the public records law, as is the governor's office,
They're
as
exempt.
is the court system.
Yeah.
So, if you write the laws, you can write them to exclude yourself, apparently, in some cases. But back to the First Amendment, which was what that was all about. I agree. Peter's quite the student of the First Amendment and has been involved in a lot of cases, I know that. I guess from the street level view, you know, from being in a community and trying to, you know, and I'm sure folks in Saugus have seen real changes in who's covering the town, you know, what kind of media coverage it gets. So you've had to rely on social media in a lot of cases. I mean, that's how people are communicating. And yet there you're bumping up against some rancor. You're certainly bumping up against what is truth and what is not truth. And I just think that has to be puzzling and really making it difficult to sort of negotiate your way to finding real information that you can use. So I guess I'd throw that out there. You know, First Amendment is here to protect the right to report things accurately. And one thing you didn't mention, Peter, is that you could lose a case if a reporter made it up, or if a reporter, you know, there's certain conditions with malice, and, you know, depending on the fame or lack of fame of the individual who might be suing you.
Now, for defamation, the reporter had to
Yeah.
either know it was false,
Right.
actually know it was false, or have reason to believe it was false, on a public figure only. Not one of you guys, not a private figure, but on a public figure such as like the Kennedys or the mayor. You have to know it was false or have reason to believe it's false. Very high standard.
So, you know, I guess I'd ask the two of you, you know, is there anything somebody in a town like Saugus could do to strengthen or to defend the First Amendment, or to get a better community agreement about how important it is?
Well, I'll tell you, from my perspective, I teach young people that the government works for them. It's not the other way around. And I make them repeat that over and over and over again throughout the semester. And I think that has to come from the bottom up. Your mayor in Saugus, you have an elected mayor here?
Unelected.
Unelected. Oh, wow.
Town manager.
Elected by
Town
three-
manager,
Three
yeah.
people.
But irregardless of how they got to the position, they work for you. You gave them the privilege, at least the elected officials, your state reps, for example. You have a city council here. I apologize, I don't know.
Town meeting form of government. the Board of
Okay.
Selectmen.
Yeah, Board of Selectmen.
But this, you know, the concept still holds true. They work for you. They are serving you. Your tax dollars are paying the bill for their paper, their pencils, their light bulbs, their, you know, they are serving you. And I think we, you know, at least from young people's perspective, when you talk about this concept and this culture that the government, you know, that we have to have this culture that the government serves us, it is not the other way around. I find they really rise up and become empowered by the notion that they can request Charlie Baker's text messages. We might not give them to them, but they have the power to request, you know, the meeting minutes in Saugus, or the, I mean, anybody can do it. In fact, speaking of the public records law, most requests made under the public records law in Massachusetts are made by, not by journalists, and that's been the case for decades, I think,
That's right.
correct? It's actually something that we should be ashamed of as journalists, that we don't request records nearly enough. But I think we've lost in this time the, you know, this attitude that at least I see it from young people. They're somewhat cowed by authority, believe it or not, even in this generation of very entitled kids. They're, you know, oh my gosh, I can ask for and get the emails of the mayor of Boston. Not only can you, you must. They serve you. We give Charlie Baker the privilege of serving us with our vote. And that attitude has to be like embedded deeply in our core, you know, that as citizens, that's how we structured things. That's how the framers structured things, that you know, that we would have 3 branches of government that would serve us, and periodically we would remove them from office with our vote or whatever. And I think we've somewhat lost that. At least I see that from the young people side of the coin. I don't know. You know, and also we're just so busy, all of us. We're so busy that keeping the government accountable, you know, is a hard, with everything else we have to do. I mean, for example, I live on the North Shore up in Marblehead, and there was a report recently about really dirty beaches in Massachusetts, and my son, you know, he swims in the ocean up in Marblehead. We all swim. My husband swims. We all swim up there. And I thought, boy, I could really go and get the raw data for all that, you know, E. coli and dirty beaches. I should do that. And that was just very, that's how it should be. I should be able to ask for that information and get it. And if we're not flexing that muscle, and if we're not using our rights, you know, if we're not exercising the rights that we have under the First Amendment, for which we fought so hard and continue to fight, that's really a shame, I think.
On what Maggie says, the ability to use the First Amendment by the media and by individuals, it's really important. Along the pollution lines, one of the stories that we've been pursuing in Newburyport in the last year that's really gotten a lot of traction is that when there are storms or really big runoff from after a snowstorm, and then the rains come and you get a huge amount of water going into the stormwater system, at sewage treatment plants up and down the Merrimack River, the plants have combined, it's called combined sewer overflows. The sewage mix, untreated sewage, gets just too much stormwater coming into it, and the treatment plants have to basically open the floodgates and let all this go into the Merrimack. So it's untreated sewage going into the Merrimack. And this happens many, many, many times every year. And nobody ever reported it. Nobody knew this was happening. So from Andover, the treatment plant, Lowell, on up the river, up to Fitchburg, the rivers that feed into the Merrimack, these treatment plants are dumping raw sewage into the river, the same river that the people boat in, they swim in, they fish in, they go to the beach. You know, it's coming right down to the mouth of the Merrimack into the Atlantic, which is Plum Island. And we found out about this, and the treatment plant, some of the treatment plant operators are very open about it. Like, yeah, we actually do report this to the government. You know, when it happens, there's like 50 million gallons of untreated stormwater and untreated sewage that went in the river last night because of that storm. I mean, millions and millions of gallons. So in the last year, we've reported every time this happens, and we've tried to document it up and down the river until you get to Manchester, New Hampshire. And apparently the laws in New Hampshire say they only have to report one time each year how many sewer overflows they had. So it's one total number. So that really stifles the ability of anybody to get that information. But it's information that should be there for the public because it actually endangers the public. One other thing about using the First Amendment as a private individual, I was the editor at the Daily out in Framingham, and one of the towns we covered was Wayland. For the 15 years I was there was a lawyer named George Harris who constantly filed open meeting law violations against different town boards, mainly the school committee. He was constantly filing public records requests to get minutes, to get the minutes of executive sessions after the time had passed that they could be kept secret. He was seeking, payroll records, really basic things that you can get because the newspaper really wasn't doing it. There was a weekly paper that was under my wing, but we were understaffed and various issues of training and experience. George was just doing this on his own. He would go to meetings in town. I don't know when he ever slept. Town officials, I'm sure, just dreaded to seeing this guy come in the room. But if you went down to the list of all of the open meeting law complaints that you can see online in the state database, you would see George Harris had filed against the school committee, against the planning board, against the Conservation Commission, and he wasn't being mean. He was doing what he felt as a citizen he needed to do to make sure that his elected and appointed officials stayed honest, basically, and that they gave people information that they wanted, that they could use, that they needed to understand how things were going in the town of Wayland. And I was incredibly impressed by the guy. I mean, it just, you know, he was dedicated. He wasn't making a dime off of it. He was probably spending a lot of money on it. And he was really doing a service to a lot of people in Wayland. A lot of whom I think probably thought he was just an arrogant troublemaker. But I think there were a lot of people who said, he's doing work for us, and it's good work. And you know, he couldn't have done that without the First Amendment backing him up.
You know, Attorney Melvin mentioned that there are three branches of government. We've always been called, the press, as the fourth estate. We are in fact the fourth estate. We oversee the three branches of government. What Richard talked about that fellow who was filing those requests, it's unfortunate that he was filing those requests. In the old days, back in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s, okay, I would file those requests. And there's a difference. When you have a medical issue and you go in and see a nurse, as opposed to seeing the head of surgery at Mass General, it's different. It's just plain different. When I used to get called for Board of Selectmen, I'm in Andover, we have Board of Selectmen, town manager, similar type of government. When the Board of Selectmen used to go into secret session, as they did on a regular basis, I would get a call from the reporter who's at the session, and they would say, Peter, they're going to executive session. I would get dressed up with my lawyer suit with a tie. I don't have a tie today because I was babysitting my grandchildren today, so I apologize for that, in Marblehead. But I would get dressed up in my tie, I would walk in the selectmen's room, and I would sit in the back of the room, okay? Like the Godfather, okay? They would say, the press attorney is here. We're not gonna go into executive session, okay? And that happened on a regular basis. When we used to have open meeting violations, or public records violations, Irving Riders, who owned the paper, used to call me and say, Peter, we can't get these records. I would go into court the next day, even Peabody, when the court was in Peabody, I would run in and I would ask on a motion session at 2 o'clock, we can't get into an open meeting, the superintendent's being elected, I can't get a public record. But Judd would lean back and it'd say to the attorney for the town, why can't the newspaper get into that meeting? Well, what do you mean, well? Tell me why. I want to know what they're talking about the superintendent too. The judge would say that, because the judges are just like you, the judges are all of you. They're regular people. The men and women who serve in the judiciary, they have towns. I would win that case, okay? I'd always win the case, because it's logical. So by having someone from the public request those records, they're never gonna get the damn things. Now, when I went in and I requested a public record, I'd have to do it for the school committee once. I'd get it. I'd have to do it twice. I'd get it. Third time, I'd get it. Fourth time, the reporter would get it, because they don't want to go into court and lose again. School committee was the exact same thing. I'd have to go in 2-3 times for the Board of Selectmen or school committee, and then they would not go into executive session. Okay?
But how does it, I'm sorry.
No, so I'm saying this because the publishers back then, both the Lynn item, owned by people from Marblehead, the Eagle Tribune, the Irving Rogers, the Quincy Patriot Ledger, the Boston Globe, owned by families. They would pay to have a lawyer go in, and it doesn't cost that much. And then they would know that you're right. Today, lawyers are not going in because of the budget crunch. That's what the problem is. If you have a problem here in Saugus, you hire an attorney to go in a couple of times, and the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, they'll stop doing what you think that they shouldn't be doing, because the power of that First Amendment. That's what you need to do, because that's where we come into play. We are the fourth estate. We oversee the government.
No, I was going to ask you, but I think you answered the question, so it doesn't matter. But to Richard's point, you know, it's like anything, and you're getting me all fired up listening to you. It's a muscle, and if you don't use it, it will atrophy. That's the word.
Wither.
It will wither. And I applaud these citizen journalists like this fellow in Wayland. I mean, he's a hero to me. Shame on us journalists that aren't using the public records law.
Right.
You know, we should be. It's there for us to be able to get information. I asked the Boston Police for information about overtime abuse in February, and I did a few stories for the Globe with my students about this overtime abuse. It's worse than the state police, I'm told. And I still don't have my records 7 months later. So I disagree with you about having a law. I think if we didn't have a law, I'll never get them. Now I have Boston University's
But
general
they use an
counsel.
exception. They point to an exception. They point to the personnel exception. That's why you're not getting those records. And the personnel exception doesn't work in Massachusetts because of the Whistler case with Judge Grasso that says everything in a personnel file is not protected. Only certain things in a personnel, but they throw that out. But so if you have someone who doesn't go into court on a regular basis, the police department and the board of selectmen, they can say, oh, it's in the personnel file, we're not gonna tell you about it.
Right.
But they're wrong. So that's why you.
Well, we are getting them, because
Good.
BU's general counsel has now gotten involved, thank God.
Great.
We are getting something. But to the point about citizens, I mean, we could learn a lot from, I mean, the First Amendment belongs to all of us.
Yeah.
I try to get my son, I try to get him to, question government and like have this attitude that, he's a citizen of this country. He's only 12, but he has just as much right to ask. I think I have convinced him that Donald Trump works for him and is not the other way around. And it has to start very young, that attitude. It has to start very young. And I'm proud that we're from Massachusetts, where it all began. John Adams and everybody.
I had a case before Sam Adams, Judge Sam Adams, in Newburyport.
Yeah.
And I'm before I'm saying, I want to get this straight, Your Honor. Are you part of the Sam Adams family? Yes, I am. There was a subpoena case. I said, well, I have a reporter. Your relatives are turning over in their grave. You can't be, John Adams, you can't be doing this. Of course, John Adams was the president that had the Sedition Act, if you go back into history, that prevented the press from saying anything. But I won't get into the John Adams issue. I talked about that. But and then just one thing. When I said who owns the First Amendment, and Maggie says rightfully that we all do.
You said I do. I think
Yes.
So
And
Richard's
the reason why
Richard's
they
publisher.
do, because the publisher can publish anything they want. And if you send a letter to the editor, they don't have to run that. If you want to oppose something, they don't have to run that. The Eagle Tribune was the only paper in the state, not to endorse John Kennedy. They could do that. At that, we can say, the paper can say anything they want. And people say, you can't say that. Yes, they can. That's why I say that the publisher has this locked up on the First Amendment.
And I'm not the publisher.
I know, but
I'm
you're the editor,
Right,
which
right.
is almost the same thing, because Karen lets you say what you want to do anyway.
No, I guess so. Yeah, I guess so.
Karen's good about that.
Yeah. So one other thing. I mean, again, because I'm wrestling with disinformation out there, and both as a private citizen reading things on Facebook and online, and as a journalist trying to get our stories out there, get them right, get them on time, be newsworthy, and inform the people in our communities. But, and I know, Peter, you said, I think I know how you're going to come down on this, but should the government take another look at just how it's a wild, wild west out there of information, disinformation? I mean, should there be limits online to freedom of speech online?
No,
No, I wouldn't say that.
absolutely positively no. Once you get on that slippery slope, the government will then tell you what the heck you're going to be publishing and what the heck you have to do. That's why some papers who are in trouble, the government said, we can help bail you out. What, are you crazy? I mean, you don't want to be beholden to any government.
Which is actually being discussed in Massachusetts
Yes.
a little bit, yeah.
No, we are damn independent. I'd rather go out of business and start from scratch. I'm a purist on that. I'm an originalist. There are about five members on the U.S. Supreme Court that belong to the Federalist Society, which is an originalist. In other words, they look at the law and they say, this is what the law says, this is what the law means. If you want to change it, the legislature can change it, but the First Amendment is what the First Amendment says.
Well, does the government have an obligation to crack down on Facebook and Google and Twitter, on the companies, to make them do a better job policing things.
It's starting with anonymous
Yeah.
speech. Anonymous speech
Yeah.
has traditionally been completely protected. You could write a review on Yelp anonymously about a bad lawyer experience you had, and you would be protected, but that's starting to shift now a little
A
bit.
bit of an erosion
Yeah.
on anonymous sources. We still can't get, when one of my papers at the Cape always gets sued for anonymous sources, I don't know why. But when they get sued, we don't have to, it's not our job. Find the anonymous source. It's not our job. We report the news. That's it, and that's our job. We don't need any laws to tell us what to do and what not to do. Now, if we do something wrong, fine. If a reporter reports, like the New York Times case, with the Judge Kavanaugh, I mean, that's insane. Those reporters should be fired immediately. They made a mistake, and everyone believed them. They've got to go, okay? And they can work anywhere else, but not there. Times publisher warns of the perils of a free press. Okay, there aren't any perils of a free press. Bad hate speech and bad speech can only be overcome not by the government, but by additional speech.
By more speech, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
By more speech. That's what counteracts it. And in 1 minute, I worked for a newspaper going through law school. I was an advertising manager at the classified advertising manager for the Eagle Tribune, going through law school. I only got the job because Judge Fenton became a judge, and they needed someone. So Irving Rogers said, "Will you take over Judge Fenton's spot?" It's the only reason I got to be a media lawyer instead of a regular lawyer. And I say that because in advertising, okay, we always promoted that if we didn't regulate ourselves, the government would put in automotive regulations, help wanted regulations, regulations that would regulate advertising. So I lectured on this in the 70s. We have to regulate ourselves. If we don't regulate ourselves in advertising, the government will come down with regulations, and they have. And it's our fault. We should have refused those ads. We have every right to refuse those ads. We should not write these stories. I blame the editors. They snuck in. How in the world did that New York Times story get in without an editor saying to the reporters, "What's your substantiation?" Okay? Can't happen. We have to regulate ourselves. I don't want the last thing I want is that's reporters' privilege. Public records law, we have exceptions. That's why we're not getting those darn records from the police department, because they're saying either privacy exemption or the personnel exemption. And they're right. And we let those go through. We have 20 exceptions to the public records law, 10 to the open meeting law. There shouldn't be an exception, not in America, Peter says.
Peterson. Yeah.
What else? You have any questions? Come on, guys.
Yeah.
This is your opportunity to actually
We're
ask
close
a lawyer a
what-
question.
what
I
you
get
did.
charged.
But if you don't mind, you got to come up here to the microphone. Yeah, we're in a small group, so it's
Thank you.
not a bad thing. Yeah.
So, I'm interested, Maggie, when you said that there are so many jobs out there. And I'm wondering, because I read my Boston Globe every day and it gets smaller and smaller, and there's so few newspapers out there when there used to be so many. How is the industry creating a business model to promote all of this journalism that you're saying is out there? And are they small entities where, kids right out of college can't get paid, or they can't afford to do this as a living or make this their profession? So I'm interested in how to promote more journalism, but have it a money-making operation.
Well, I don't know that I can address the financial end of it, but I will say there are maybe fewer newspapers, but there are hundreds and hundreds of outstanding online news outlets now, one of which has won the Pulitzer Prize and beaten out mainstream media for the last several years, ProPublica in New York. Many new investigative reporting outlets have started, from the New England Center to Investigative Reporting, which I co-founded, to iNewsSource in San Diego, which has broken a lot of stories. Newspapers are just being complemented now by different ways of delivering the news. Reveal, which does audio reporting and has won incredible awards for the work they're doing out in San Francisco. Mississippi Today, which is an online-only site which is dedicated just to covering the cold cases of the civil rights movement. I mean, the work that is being done on investigative journalism is absolutely outstanding. I mean, look at and this was a traditional news outlet, the Miami Herald. Look at what that reporter broke down in Miami. I see the jobs on all of the different job boards a lot for entry-level reporters who have good tech skills. You know, I mean, just because this printed page is being transformed into a different delivery model does not mean, but I've already said this, does not mean that journalism is dying. Far from it. I mean, I really believe this. I've never seen it as robust in terms of a job market. Now, you know, what the business model is for that, I'm not equipped to answer that question. Newspapers made enormous profits, which is why I think, you know, there's been such a struggle to hold on to them. They were, you know, do news organizations need to make the kind of profits that newspapers make? Is that really our sole function as news organizations? But there literally are hundreds and hundreds of news organizations in this country that did not exist in 2007 when I started, and they are superior. You know, ProPublica Illinois has broken a story recently about how and they're young reporters, about how children in Chicago were being, their parents, I guess they maxed out on the financial aid they could get their students. I mean, they could get their kids. So they had guardians appointed to them. So the kids were actually under a guardianship so they could get more financial aid. Like scams that we really need to know about, you know.
Maggie, if I
Yeah.
can just jump in there, I have a very different view
Yep.
from Maggie. I love her optimism. I'm much less optimistic. I very much agree that, I mean, I've heard, you know, newspapers dying. I've heard it's a cliche. I agree. They are not dying. They are transforming into other ways of publishing. Everything is doing that. And the internet has changed everything that way. But the numbers of journalists, I think, are down. What she's talking about is the technical skills and the training that's necessary to get those jobs is much higher. The number of entry-level reporter jobs for publications, whether in print or online, that would be covering the town of Saugus, or covering Rowley, or covering Ipswich, they're way down. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem in Middle America. It's a big problem in Massachusetts. Local news coverage has dropped off a lot. News organizations don't have as much revenue. They don't hire as many people. Their staff is much smaller. When I was in Framingham, it was a regional newspaper, the Metro West Daily News, and when a round of cuts would come through, we pulled back our coverage. We're not going to, you know, we were covering 23 towns. Now we're covering 19 towns. Now we're covering 17 towns. When I left, it was 9. And I can't tell you how many people I laid off in those cuts. So it was devastating. And it was devastating for the people in the towns. Because that, you know, and again, don't get me wrong, investigative reporting is essential to uncover things and to tell people what's going on behind the scenes and how they're getting cheated, how they're getting, their health may be hurt. I mean, look at the Flint water scandal. It's incredible. But a lot of journalism is just covering the Board of Selectmen and just covering the planning board and being able to tell people what that big development proposal is that's going to change your taxes. It's going to flood your school system with more kids. You know, it's going to wreak havoc on a local water system that can barely handle the number of people in town now. I mean, that's local reporting. That's what we do in Newburyport. And it's essential. There are more, it's easier now, I don't mean to drone on here, but it's easier now to become your own publisher and to do reporting. That's because of the internet. You don't need to own presses. You don't need to have the high expense levels that you would if you were printing newspapers and delivering them. There's a guy in the town of Ipswich who runs a one-person online news operation. He's a web designer, so he created his own site, but he is in town and he runs around covering a lot of stuff, and he requests a lot of public records. He's a good data miner. He's a decent photographer, so he's covering Ipswich and a little bit of the surrounding towns by himself, selling some ads online, so he's supporting himself. I was on a panel with him a few weeks ago, and somebody said, "So John, you know, what happens if you get hit by a truck?" And he said, "Well, there wouldn't be anybody to cover it." You know?
Good
And
answer.
yeah, and so there wouldn't be anybody to pick up what, and the people in Ipswich, if you talk to them, they really appreciate the coverage. I mean, he's very objective, he's very energetic, and every town should have that kind of news coverage, and they don't. I mean, I know
See,
that.
newspapers are not dying. For all of you who were around in 1948, 1949, newspapers were not the main source of information. The Eagle Tribune, Essex County's largest newspaper, was not known, or the Irving Rogers family, was not known for its newspaper. It was known throughout America and in the Merrimack Valley for its radio station.
Right.
Okay? Radios were the prime source of news in the 1940s. And then what happened to radio? Television came. And when television came, they said, "Oh my God, radio is going out the window." Here it is in 2019, we still have radio. Fewer stations, they didn't make as much revenue because TV took it away. Same with newspapers. We're not making as much revenue. Newspapers used to, I get shot for saying this, but newspapers used to have a net profit of 45%.
Wow.
Okay? 45% was the net profit for newspapers. That's where they gave back to the community. You had libraries and hospitals and foundations by newspapers. 45%. Now, the newspapers only make about 17% profit. Okay? That's pretty good. Okay, 17 is not bad. It's not great. Okay? But they're still in the black. Okay, newspapers still. But they had to cut the newsrooms to do that. But that's our newsrooms. So we're still going to be, I think we're going to be around. I get delivered to my home every morning 3 newspapers, okay? My sons think I'm absolutely crazy. I have 2 sons, a lawyer and a financial advisor at my son. They think I'm crazy, but we get 3 newspapers. We used to get 4. We used to get the New York Times, but the New York Times went off the left-hand side, and my wife canceled it and got a report and got an actual telephone call from the New York Times. Said, "You've been a subscriber for 25 years." She says, "What happened?" He says, "Your front pages are crazy. They're wrong. They're fake news. They're wrong news." "Well, what can I give you to an editor so that you can maybe talk to the editor and we get you back?" She says, "No way." Bang, she hangs up. We still get the Globe. We get the Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and the Eagle Tribune. And I also subscribe to the Annual Townsman. So we get 4 newspapers in our house. Nobody, my sons think we're crazy. On the First Amendment, I just want to shift back to the First Amendment for a moment. Back a couple of years ago, we had this Boston Common of people who want to speak on Boston Common, if you remember that. Yeah. And you have the governor and the mayor and the police chief said allow them to speak in the Boston Common. But they had a 40-yard barrier behind the Boston Common. Now the press thought, press lawyers thought, the First Amendment, we weren't affected. We could actually cover the damn thing. We could actually hear what they were saying. But no, the press and the reporters were not allowed, and media attorneys were not allowed 40 yards away from what they were saying. So we have a First Amendment in the United States. The governor, the mayor, and the police chief said, no, you have to be 40 yards away. So my explanation for that was, when we had the Boston Tea Party, and King George in England would say, you guys, the revolutionists, all your colonists, you can complain all you want. We're going to put you on a boat. We're going to put you 40 yards out in Boston Harbor, and you can talk and yell as loud as you want, and we're not going to say anything. That's what happened in Boston, Massachusetts. We have a right to speak in America, okay? We also have the right to listen. If we don't have the right to listen, the right to speech goes out the window. If they force us not to hear, not to listen, then what do we have the right to speak? So we have 4 rights. And I was on a radio stock host called me and said, do we have the right to listen? I said, I don't know. I only lecture on the right to speak. So I did some research. We have in America the right to speak and the right to listen. If we don't have the right to listen, it throws the right to speak out. We also have the right against compelled speech. Can someone force us to say something? Can we be forced to give a political opinion? Can we be forced to say anything? No, we should not be able to be forced to say anything. We have that right to be silent. And also, how about the right against compelled listening? Can they force you to listen to an abortion lecture? Can they force you to listen to President Trump? Can they force you to do that? Can they put you in a room and shackle you and say, you gotta listen? No, not in America. Maybe in, as I tell the judges, maybe in Cuba, maybe in Ukraine. I don't want to say this yet. Can I say that? Maybe in Russia, okay, but not in America. They cannot. We have the right to speak. We have the right to listen. We have the right against compelled speech, and we have the right against compelled listening. And the cases, there are cases on that, and some of you know these cases. Remember the Citizens United case? That was just before Hillary. You know, it was a film against Hillary. I said, you can't have that just before the election. What are you, crazy? Went up before the Supreme Court, and they won. And everyone got all pissed off, and they all got upset. And then what comes about? The Fahrenheit 9/11 case, the Michael Moore case, for the Bush campaign. Same idea, same thing. So we had one Democratic say, oh, don't run it, and the Bush, Michael Moore did the same thing. Both those cases won. The public has a right to say, and we have a right to listen. We don't have to agree, but they can't force us not to. So very First Amendment right is really cool. How about Consolidated Edison case? The right to insert in billion envelopes anything that they want to. Yes, if you have like the gas company, if you open up your gas bill, you have inserts in there, and it talks about maybe some political thing that you're not particularly happy about. But they're giving you that to you. They have the right to do that. They have to do that. So all of these cases, if you even for advertising, go to my advertising hat. Imagine if the advertiser, okay, was not allowed to sell their goods. You were prohibited to listen to Charlie Day on Commonwealth Motors, who I sat next to for 4 years in high school, so I can talk about Charlie. But for Commonwealth Motors, for him and his family on TV, if you were prohibited, he couldn't sell cars. Advertising would go out of business. Business would go out of business. So you can't afford to do that. And then I'll end on even freedom of speech. People ask me all the time when I was in advertising, I want to run this ad. And I'd look at it, and it would be something that I don't think should be in the paper, whether it was a fly-by-night person from out of state. And I would say, no, I'm not going to accept the ad. Political ads, same thing. Okay, and at least not in the electronic medium, but newspapers. Newspapers can refuse any ad at any time for no reason. If you give a reason, you're going to be sued for giving whatever the reason is. But we can refuse any ad. The First Amendment allows the newspaper publisher to publish whatever he wants to put in his or her paper. We are not compelled to run an advertisement. We are not compelled to run any type of political advertisement or news story. No one can force us to run a news story, at least not in America. First Amendment right.
Okay. Thank you, Peter.
We need questions.
Yeah.
But I just
So let's
want
hear
to
from-
circle back to your point, and it's interesting listening to Richard, because, being on the front lines and having to lay people off must be extremely painful, and I have not had to do that. I do see my students get hired regularly, but they're not getting hired to cover towns like Ipswich. They're getting hired at places like Law 360 in New York and Politico and, these newer models. But, I was just thinking about, I do think we're in a transformative era. We haven't figured out the new business model. There's some thinking that, found a mix of foundation support and commercial enterprises may be mixing those together, because the philanthropists have definitely risen up and given out millions to support all these new sites. But
ProPublica,
ProPublica,
$10 million.
us. We raised,
$10 million.
I never raised a dime in my life. I couldn't, and we raised $250,000 to start our center. But my point is, you know that quote from Thomas Edison that, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. Like, we're just, I think, in that transformative era where we're figuring out what is the new business model, or what are the new business models going to be, and hopefully they'll still be rooted in the principles that the country was founded on: truth, fairness, accuracy. I feel a deep sense of shame if I ever get anything wrong. Like, I don't know about these journalists at the New York Times, but I know that if I made regular mistakes in my reporting, I would not work. I don't know many reporters today who would work. It was the most shameful thing I ever felt was when I had an error in my story. That's how bad it is.
Including the middle initial of a politician, or the middle initial of
Can I make that
someone.
mistake? No, you know what I wrote once? This is a funny story I'll have to tell you. We had a politician in Massachusetts named Diane Wilkerson,
Oh, sure.
and she, this is really a funny story. She was in trouble for, she was always in trouble for spending campaign finance money that she wasn't supposed to be spending. And I was looking in a big rush through her campaign finance account. She had just been indicted for campaign finance violations, and there was the name of a restaurant. It later turned out to be a name of a restaurant, but I wrote a story that said she spent, $60 on a new bra. Well, it was actually $60 at a restaurant called Brasserie Joe, but I was in such a rush that I made a mistake. So I got in a lot of trouble from Joe Shaka for that, my editor.
I'd like to see that correction. That's a tough one to write.
She was really mad, and the funny thing was, about 2 years later, she was videotaped by the FBI stuffing
That's right.
money into her bra.
Right.
So you were right.
So anyway, you have to have some humility as a reporter, and you can't make mistakes.
Yeah. That's your
At the
reputation.
Tribune, when I was there, if Judge Jelena would run around and you make a mistake on the middle initial of someone in the community of notary, and you would get lambasted for the next week. That's a middle initial, not even a last name or a first name.
That's how it should be.
That's how particular. And the news, and then the compositor in the newsroom, Leo, used to come out to us, and the compositor, a union compositor, used to read everything. Said, there shouldn't be a comma there, and what about the exclamation point? That's grammatically incorrect. That's how particular newspapers were back in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s.
Not today, you're right.
But
No,
that's
we've
how
definitely
particular
lost
that they
that.
were.
Well, and today, people call me and, if we have an error or something grammatical that's not quite right, and I'll take the call. Well, don't you have proofreaders? No,
Not
we
anymore.
don't.
We did.
I mean, that's who I am in part, yeah, we did. So there's just fewer eyeballs on things, and I'm not making excuses for errors in newspapers, but they're gonna happen.
So Richard asked whether we should have the government intervene. Well, I'm going to say yes on this point, and you have to listen to me on this. This is a quote: "The right of a listener to receive information is also a key to participatory democracy. Democratic decision-making, after all, is about citizen listeners making informed and intelligent evaluations and judgments." James Madison said that a couple of hundred years ago. "The public, as sovereign, must have all information available in order to instruct its servants, like government." Okay? Democratic self-government, granting everybody the opportunity to participate in government. So I say that the state, the governor, the mayor, and the police chief, the state has an affirmative duty to help speakers communicate. They have an affirmative duty to help speakers communicate. not to have them not communicate, but the government should help speakers communicate.
Did they claim it was a safety issue, the barrier?
Absolutely. And what happens afterwards? There was all these everyone was getting beaten up on the edges.
Was it content neutral as far as the?
No. It was a white supremacist
I know, but
rally.
would they have used the same argument if it was another group up there on the stand?
Probably not. I mean, I was there. I was 40 yards away, and it could have, if the press had been allowed to gather around there, have cameras, have microphones, that would have at least been the conduit to report what they were saying.
Certainly.
And they would have been safe.
And they had loudspeakers,
Yeah.
but it's
You
40
couldn't-
yards
you
away.
couldn't hear them.
They couldn't hear them.
Right.
It was horrendous, and I blame the governor, and I blame the police
Yeah,
chief, and public safety. No, they just didn't agree with what was being said on the podium.
Right.
But, we should take your questions. Does anybody have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I would say they got more ink from that exclusion than if
Yeah,
it
you're right.
actually been reported, but that's another thing. Like,
At the very beginning, when you were introducing this whole thing, you mentioned that the term fake news was being used overseas and in other venues. And I was just wondering, they're talking about our press, the way Donald Trump talks about our press, and they're saying that our press is fake news as well, or are they criticizing Donald Trump
No,
for
no.
saying that?
For the most part, they're using fake news to label the reporters in their country who are reporting on them, to delegitimize the press that's covering them on a regular basis.
So
They're not talking about us.
They learned this from Donald Trump.
Absolutely,
I
yeah.
see. Well, thank you
You
very
learn
much.
it from somebody, and that's kind of where I first heard it.
Thank
So,
you.
But
yeah.
what I said about flexing the muscle, if we
Yeah.
don't, reporters, Mitt Romney was the governor here for a long time, and I took a leave of absence for a year. I went and did this fellowship at Harvard, at the Neiman Foundation, and I had covered Mitt Romney before I left, and then when I came back, I covered Mitt Romney, and I went to the press conference at the State House, and he was getting an award from the National Guard, and he was just about to run for president of the United States. And he was getting this award from the National Guard, and all the reporters were, nobody was asking any tough questions. Everybody was just writing, oh, Mitch is getting an award from. So I raised my hand and asked what I thought was a legitimate question, was, about whether anyone in his family, immediate family, had ever served in the National Guard, served in the military. And he was livid. I got called down to his office afterwards. How dare you ask that question? Of course, Mike Wallace asked it like a year later, and he didn't get any guff for it. But some reporters there were very critical of me. How dare she ask the governor that question? That was so out of line.
Right.
And I thought, are you kidding me? This is our job.
Mhm.
He was being draped in glory by the National Guard, and not a single one. I mean, he didn't serve in the military. None of his boys served in the military. Not that they had to, but he was running for president. He had just that morning, I think, said he supported the Iraq War. So my point is, if we don't use the First Amendment and question government and keep them accountable, we don't serve Mitt Romney. He serves us. And I think that was really, I just remember that being so jarred by that. I was so stunned that instead of the other reporters backing me up, they were criticizing. Did you have a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
See, you were way out of line, okay?
Like
Because
what?
in the JFK, no one would dare ask JFK that kind of a question. Okay, the
I was
press,
like this.
that's right.
Governor,
So
Governor.
you asked the question, another reporter said, what do you ask?
Who's that lunatic?
You're out of line. Same with JFK. They would never ask JFK that kind of a question because he had a love relationship with the press.
Sure, yeah.
Maybe the poor man had bone spurs.
Yeah,
Well, that,
I'm not sure. It wasn't,
that
believe
was
me, I have a
Trump,
son. I would
yeah.
never want to send him to war.
Yeah.
I wasn't criticizing Mitt Romney for not.
No, just a question.
But he was about to run for he was,
believe me, I understand those.
Yeah, but no, I get your, that, maybe he did, I don't know. But he was furious. I was asked to come down to his office, and I said, fine, I'll come down, but I'm bringing my tape recorder.
Good.
Why were the other journalists such sycophants?
Well, but that's my point, and that's what I worry about with the young people today, that they're cowed by authority. Well, no, we have to flip it around. I will just repeat myself, the government works for us, it is not the other way around.
Question everything.
But I was really out of line, I think.
You weren't part of the
I was
club.
told I was way out of
You
line.
weren't part of the club of reporters.
How dare you ask me that question?
So any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah, can you take the microphone there?
Okay, the First Amendment to me is the most important, or it was obviously because it's first. However, do you feel today that, especially, you know, a couple of you have been around for a while, do you feel that today that it's more work to get the truth than it is to be told the truth through the open meeting law, you know, violations and asking for minutes that more specific, you know, whatever. If an article is presented or anything that can go on, do you feel that today, and for whatever reason, you need, you know, it's less to give you the truth up front, and then you have to beg to get your answer, like you're trying to get through the overtime.
There's an old line of, you know, if one person tells you it's raining outside and the other person tells you the sun is out and it's sunny, you don't just report what the two of them say. You stick your head out the window and you find out for yourself. So that's what I think a good reporter does. I don't think people ask for documents and public records and payrolls without a reason, and the reason is usually to see for themselves and to verify for themselves as a reporter. You know, a town treasurer might give you, a lot of them will just give you the stuff. A lot of town officials know these are public records. You don't have to fight for them. Just call me up, send me an email. We get things all the time. But you want to see the records. You know, I mean, somebody can tell you, oh yeah, we you know, the town is in the black and whatever, everything's great. It's a reporter's job to verify that. It's like Peter saying, 2 sources, 3 sources. I mean, those are different sources. Those are 3 different people not working together, comparing notes. There's 3 different people giving that reporter information, and by getting those 3 sources, you're confirming, you're feeling really confident that that's true. And you'll stand on that. That's why you get those sources.
And I think it's such a great time to become a journalist, because you now, with the skills that a lot of journalists have, we can, what did we scrape from the web the other day?
You might have to define the scraping.
Oh, okay. So here I know, I apologize.
She's using jargon. I
I'm
teach
using
my
jargon.
students not to use jargon.
No, we shouldn't. So, for example, if I wanted to go to City Hall and get all the liquor law violations that the town of Saugus has issued to all the bars and restaurants, I would, when I was a young reporter, I would go, or town hall or whatever, and they would, if they weren't mad at me that day, which I was often frequently by Tom Menino, the mayor of Boston, maybe I would get the paper records or not. But today, we can write programs or point and click, and the information is digitized, it's online, so we can pull it down from the web and just get it in 2 seconds. So that's what I mean by scraping. It's information is online, and we can pull it down with a computer program. Like my students did that with NFL arrest data the other day, and because somebody keeps a digital version of every NFL player that is arrested. So it's in some ways, the comptroller of Massachusetts he pays every bill for Massachusetts, and we often look and see what are the settlement payouts that how many payments have they paid to victims of police abuse or wrongful termination or something. So much information is digitized and in the computer, and there's so much that's accessible. You could get all the food violations that have been issued in Saugus or the, you know, all the police reports or the fire reports are very, very quickly. And so it's a great time to become a reporter because that information is digitally available to you in voluminous quantities. That's what I mean by scrape. It really means just extracting information from a website.
Just for the record, I also think it's a great time to be a reporter and to be a student of journalism getting into the business. I just see differences in where the jobs are. There are
Yeah.
definitely jobs out there, and there will be a need, I think, forever for people who know how to do good reporting. It's just a change of where that's being published.
And I wonder if it's shifting back almost to like colonial times. Instead of having paid reporters for news organizations covering towns like Ipswich, are we having the citizen journalist rise up and
point.
become the
In some
chronicler
cases, yeah.
of their town, like
Good point.
the fellow in Wayland and why not? The citizens know their town better than anybody. Maybe that's how it should be.
Right.
Maybe things are just self-correcting.
Maybe.
Maybe that is the optimistic.
Yeah. On that note, are there any other questions?
So we talk about the First Amendment, and as you said, it's the First Amendment, so it's the most important amendment because it's the First Amendment. I always like to remind people that if you go to the archives in Washington, D.C. and look at the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment was the Third Amendment. Okay? The very First Amendment had to do with representation and how many members would be in Congress based upon the population. For every 3,000 people, there'd be one member. Okay, and I checked that before I came, if we did that today, you would have 6,350 members of Congress. Okay? So back then, they were wise enough to say, we don't know how many people are going to be in America, so they threw that out. The Second Amendment, which wasn't the right to carry arms, as it has today, the Second Amendment had to do with compensation for some of the congressional people. So it had to do with compensation, that they couldn't figure out how much to pay people, that got thrown out. So by default, Congress shall make no law abusing the freedom of the press and religion. That became the First Amendment. So the First Amendment today, as we know it, is really the First Amendment. I always say the same to judges. It's the most important, Your Honor, it's the First Amendment of the Congress. And they don't know what I'm talking about. They have no idea it's really the Third Amendment. But so I don't want you to leave here the First Amendment talk realizing that the First
It's the
Amendment.
first in our hearts.
Yes, it is.
And minds.
That's correct. Yeah,
All right.
it is.
Sure.
With recent changes to the open meeting law and the enforcement of it, it used to be a guy in Essex County named Bob Bender that would get the phone call. Now is a cumbersome process where you have to write a letter to the chairman of that particular committee. You have to wait a period of time. If you're not satisfied with that answer, you have to send something to the Attorney General. The record for the Attorney General on the open meeting law is such that if you look at the fines that they've given, maybe one in the last 2 years, and I think it was Wayland.
Mm-hmm. It was.
So it appears that the legislature, whether knowingly or not, has weakened the open meeting law, and you have to be a Philadelphia lawyer or hire your firm as a citizen to engage it. Now, I've had several open meeting law violations that I have won as a member of.
You always win 'em.
Yeah.
But
But when you have a committee or a member of a committee or chairman of a committee says it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission,
Right.
when you have that mentality in a community, the law seems to be working against public enforcement. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. We now can have, you can now get illegal fees if you show that they blatantly violated them. That was, Bill Ketter and I had actually helped draft part of the open meeting law. Do I like it? It's better than what it was, 8 years ago. We can now get some compensation if you show that they violated it. The Boston City Council, when they want to hire people, they had this open door thing that they would interview candidates, and they wouldn't have a quorum. They would have 5 people go in, and the judge says, you can't do that. Okay, fine, I'm sorry, we did it. And said, don't worry about it. They did the same thing the next year. The judge gave them a $1,000 fine. So they got fined. The open meeting law And no, if you hired a lawyer to go in for an open meeting, I have never lost an open meeting law case because it should be open. Okay, so you have to hire someone, and we don't charge that much. Boston lawyers will charge you, we've been recorded, thousands of dollars. To go to a suburban lawyer, it's gonna cost you like $800, and you're gonna win right in the motion session. So I have on how long it takes to get a response for an open meeting law, okay? I could have another grandchild by the time I get an answer.
Right.
30 days, not, 30 days for the public body. Okay, then 14 days if they need more time, 7 days for more information, 10 days, to maybe talk to the AG, 10 days for the public body to act. That's 58 days, up to 58 days. 30 days, not business days, to complain to the Attorney General.
Right.
It's 90 days.
Plus they get extensions.
They always get said, and the superintendent will be elected by then.
Right.
From the open meeting, and that's what happened. So you got to go into court that week and say, stop. I want the open, and how often, this is about the caucus thing, but how often does the AG, how often does the Attorney General, the public records, supervisor of public records, has absolutely no teeth at all. Any opinion you give, they have no teeth at all. Open meeting, the DA is supposed to have jurisdiction over that. They used to, Bob Bender. But Bob Bender used to. Now it goes to the AG.
Right.
You'll never get, why would the AG rule against a municipality? I know that's heresy to say that. Of course we're going to rule against the municipality if they've done something wrong. Baloney. You're asking one government entity to rule that another government entity made a mistake. Boy, it's a high bar. However, if you go in as a citizen, or as a newspaper, we're getting thrown out. You go in as a citizen, okay, to a court, the judge is going to say, why was it a secret meeting? Why wasn't it open? And you're going to get it open, an injunction, just like that. I'm telling you. But you're right. Bob Bender used to give me some answers when I used to call him and ask him for those, but no longer the AG.
But maybe more cost effective is get a friendly reporter to, like shame is a great motivator, get a friendly reporter to do a story about that. We do stories all the time about violations of government transparency, and we should be doing more of them, frankly. And if you can't afford Peter's high fees, you could maybe afford, if there's repeated violations, that's a great story.
So I say this, and I'll say this on film, because I said this yesterday at the NEFAC conference, and I'll say it again. If a newspaper cannot afford to pay me to go in to fight an open meeting violation or public records violation, I will do it for free. And I have done that, okay? In fact, I was so upset at the Lawrence paper that I filed the public records myself, and a little embarrassing, they thought the newspaper had filed it, and they sent the public record to the newspaper, of which I got a call, immediately saying, we didn't hire you, we can't pay you. I says, no, you didn't. I was so livid that they violated the open meeting law public, that I filed it, and I got it the next day, because they're wrong. So I will, in fact, there's no fee, I will do something for no cost on either public record or an open meeting law for anyone.
I would ask Maggie, do you teach your students how to file an open meeting law
we teach
complaint?
all the time. They're doing public records in class all the time. And it should be a required class, that they should be, we're requesting, you've heard about the state drug lab scandal. So we're requesting all the payments that are being made, tens of millions of dollars in payments that are being made to these drug lab defendants who got their cases swept away. And we're requesting information on animals. I guess there's an uptick in rabies in Massachusetts, rabid animals. And we're requesting the database of from Environmental Affairs of rabid animals. We do it all the time. And yeah.
All right, I think we are right up against we turn in a pumpkin here in the library, so we appreciate everybody coming to.
Thank you so much. It was fun. Thanks for having us.